WW2 Eastern Front and Soviet War Realities. Discussed by Shane Gillis and Matt McCusker. Matt and Shane Simply Pub, MSSP. The bar was nearly empty. It was the kind of late hour when the background noise fades and all that remains is the sound of two voices and the occasional clink of a glass. Shane Gillis leaned back in his chair, turning a coaster over in his fingers the way he always did when something was working in his mind. Matt McCusker sat across from him, elbows on the table, looking at nothing in particular but clearly seeing something very specific. They had started the night talking about other things. A movie. A phone call. Something one of them had read. But as it often happened with these two, the conversation had drifted toward history, and once it drifted there, it rarely came back. "You ever really sit down and think about the Eastern Front?" Shane asked. Matt looked at him. "Like, genuinely think about it?" "Yeah. Not just like World War II. The Eastern Front specifically. What was actually happening over there?" Matt picked up his glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down. "I have," he said. "And it messes with you." That was where it began. The Eastern Front of World War II is one of the largest and most terrible events in all of recorded human history. It is not a subject that lends itself to casual conversation. It is not the kind of thing you can wrap up neatly and put away. But Shane and Matt were the kind of people who believed that the best way to respect something serious was not to avoid it, but to look at it directly. So they looked. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched an invasion of the Soviet Union called Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest military operation ever attempted by any nation in history. More than 3 million soldiers crossed the Soviet border in a single day. They came with tanks, aircraft, artillery, and horses. They came in waves. The plan was simple and brutal: move fast, destroy everything in the path, and reach Moscow before winter arrived. Shane shook his head slowly when he thought about the scale of it. 3 million soldiers, he said. In one day. Can you picture that? You're a farmer in some village in Ukraine, and you wake up in the morning, and the sky is full of planes and the ground is shaking, and your entire world just ends. Matt nodded. And the people who were supposed to protect you were not ready. That was the other part of the story. The Soviet military in 1941 was not the army it should have been. A few years earlier, Joseph Stalin had grown paranoid about his own generals. He feared that experienced military men might one day challenge his power. So he had many of them removed, put on trial, and executed. Thousands of officers, men who knew how to fight, who had trained for years, were gone. In their place were men who were loyal to Stalin but had little experience on a battlefield. When Germany crossed the border, the result was catastrophic. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and cut off. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured in the first weeks alone. The Red Army, which was supposed to be one of the most powerful forces on Earth, appeared to simply fall apart. Stalin himself, Matt said, apparently went quiet for days after the invasion started. Just went into his house and didn't come out. The guy who had been ruthless his whole life, Shane said, and then the thing he had been pretending couldn't happen, happened. And in those few days, nobody knew what to do. Because nobody was allowed to make a decision without him. When Stalin did come back, he made decisions that were hard to understand from any normal human perspective. One of the first major orders he issued told Soviet commanders that any soldier who surrendered to the enemy was a traitor. Not a prisoner of war. Not an unfortunate soul caught in a terrible situation. A traitor. And if a soldier was captured and his family was still in the Soviet Union, his family could be arrested as well. Shane sat very still when he thought about that. "So you're telling me," he said, "that a kid who gets surrounded by 1 million German soldiers, with no ammunition and no orders and nowhere to run, and he puts his hands up because what else is he going to do, and back home, his mother gets taken away." That's what the order said. That is genuinely one of the worst things I have ever heard. And yet, Matt said, millions of those men kept fighting. That was the part that both of them kept returning to throughout the night. Not the cruelty of the system, though the cruelty was real and enormous. What fascinated them was the human being inside that system. The young man from a small town who had never asked to be a soldier, who had been handed a rifle and told to hold a line, who had every reason in the world to give up, and who kept going anyway. Why does a person do that? What is left inside someone when everything around them has turned to chaos? It's the guy next to you, Shane said. I really believe that. At a certain point, it's not about the country or the leader or the cause. It's just the one specific person standing next to you who is also scared, who is also exhausted, who you've eaten next to and slept next to for months. You fight for him. Because he's the only real thing left. By late 1942, the battle had shifted to a city on the Volga River called Stalingrad. The city had the name of the Soviet leader, and because of that, it carried enormous weight on both sides. Hitler wanted it badly. Stalin would not give it. The result was a battle that lasted nearly 6 months and consumed human life on a scale that is still difficult to comprehend. At the peak of the fighting, the average life expectancy for a Soviet soldier newly arrived in Stalingrad was less than 1 day. 24 hours. A man would cross the Volga River on a boat, reach the western bank, and be gone before the next morning. Matt said it out loud, less than a day. Shane looked at the table. Less than a day, he repeated. You get off the boat and that's it. The city had been reduced to rubble. Buildings that once held families and shops and schools were now broken walls and collapsed floors, and inside those broken spaces, soldiers from both sides fought for single rooms, single stairwells, single windows. A factory that had been producing goods for the city was now a battlefield where men moved through the dark trying to find each other before being found themselves. One of the most remarkable figures to emerge from Stalingrad was a young Soviet sniper named Vasily Zaitsev. He was from the Ural Mountains and had grown up hunting in the forests near his home. In the ruins of Stalingrad, those skills became something different. He moved quietly through the debris, found positions that offered angles no one else had considered, and waited. Over the course of the battle, he eliminated more than 200 enemy soldiers. But Zaitsev was not the story. He was a detail inside the story. The story was the city itself. The story was what it meant to live, or try to live, inside a place where every building was a potential end. I think about the civilians, Matt said. The people who were just there when it started. Who had nowhere to go. Some of them ended up fighting, Shane said. People who had never held a weapon. Factory workers. Women. Old men. Because when there is no one left, there is no one left. There was another layer to the Soviet war effort that did not appear in most stories told about the conflict. It was called the Strafbat, which meant penalty battalion. These were units made up of soldiers who had been accused of cowardice, or had retreated without orders, or had done something that someone in authority had decided was an act of disloyalty. These soldiers were stripped of their rank and their normal rights as military personnel. They were sent to the most dangerous assignments the army had to offer. One of those assignments was walking through minefields. Not with special equipment. On foot. To clear a path for the soldiers behind them. Shane looked across the table. They walked through minefields. That was how a man could prove himself, Matt said. That was the way back. You walked through the minefield, and if you came out the other side, or even if you were wounded, you had paid your debt. Wounded counted. Being wounded counted as redemption. Your blood was the payment. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the street was quiet. A car passed slowly. Neither of them spoke. There was also another detail that did not get much attention. Behind the Soviet front lines, in certain situations, there were units called blocking detachments. Their role was to stand behind the regular soldiers and make sure no one retreated without orders. If men broke and ran, the blocking detachments were authorized to stop them by force. So you're in the front, Shane said. And there are German soldiers in front of you trying to destroy you. And there are Soviet soldiers behind you making sure you don't run. And you're just standing in the middle. That was the reality for a lot of men, Matt said. The direction you ran in determined who shot at you. One of the quieter and largely forgotten parts of the Soviet war effort was the role played by supplies coming from the United States and Britain through a program called Lend-Lease. The Soviet Union, in the years after the war, rarely mentioned it. The official story was that the Soviet people had stood alone and won through strength and sacrifice alone. That was not entirely accurate. From 1941 through 1945, the United States sent enormous quantities of equipment to the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of trucks and vehicles. Food, including large amounts of canned meat. Boots. Clothing. Radio equipment. Aircraft. The Soviet Army by 1944, Matt said, was largely moving on American vehicles. Shane raised an eyebrow. They never mentioned that in the Soviet version of history. They did not. Because it did not fit the story they were telling about themselves. The story of Leningrad also entered the conversation. That city, now called St. Petersburg, was placed under a German siege in September 1941. The siege lasted for 872 days. Nearly 900 days. During that time, the city was cut off from supplies. People ran out of food. They burned furniture for warmth. They ate whatever could be eaten. Pets disappeared early. Then things that were not meant to be eaten at all. Shane did not say anything for a while after Matt described it. Then he said, "That's almost 3 years. 872 days, Matt confirmed. And people survived that. Some of them. Not all. Somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people in that city died during the siege. Most of them from hunger. The number sat in the air between them. 1 million people. In one city. Not from bombs or battles, but from having nothing to eat. By the spring of 1945, the Red Army had pushed across Eastern Europe and was approaching Berlin. The city that had launched all of this, that had sent 3 million soldiers east 4 years earlier, was now surrounded. The soldiers who entered it were carrying the memory of every village that had been burned, every family that had been destroyed, every friend who had not made it back. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Germany surrendered. The celebrations in the Soviet Union were enormous and completely genuine. People who had lost almost everything still found something inside themselves to celebrate with. But the story did not end there for many of the men who had fought. Soviet soldiers who had spent years in German prisoner-of-war camps, who had endured terrible conditions and survived only through extraordinary willpower, came home to find that their own government considered them suspects. The logic, in the twisted way that Stalin's system worked, was that a real Soviet soldier should have died rather than be captured. The fact that they were still alive meant something was wrong with them. Many of these men, after surviving years of captivity, were sent directly to Soviet labor camps without trials. They survived the Germans, Shane said quietly. And then they got sent to a camp by their own people. Some of them, Matt said. Yes. There was also the matter of the generals who had actually won the war. Men like Georgy Zhukov, who had led some of the most important Soviet operations and whose military skill had been essential to the ultimate victory. After the war, Stalin did not celebrate these men for long. He was suspicious of anyone who had become too well known, too respected, too popular with ordinary people. Zhukov was eventually removed from positions of real influence and sent to oversee minor military regions far from Moscow. The man who had helped save the country was rewarded by being made invisible. It was getting late. The bar had reached the point where the staff were moving slowly and quietly, doing the things that bars do at the end of a long night. Shane and Matt had been sitting for hours. 27 million, Matt said, almost to himself. That was the estimated number of Soviet citizens who had died during the war. Soldiers and civilians. Men, women, and children. 27 million people. Shane looked at the table. There is no way to really hold that number in your head. You can't. It's too big. The only way in is through one person at a time. That was what they kept coming back to. History at this scale was not really something the human mind could process as a whole. You could say 27 million and the words were accurate, but they did not land. What landed was something smaller. A single detail. A specific image. A 19-year-old boy from a small village west of Moscow who had never been more than 50 miles from home, who had been handed a rifle and told to hold a position, who had been cold and frightened and hungry for months, who had watched people next to him disappear and somehow found a way to keep standing. He probably did not think of himself as part of history. He probably thought about warmth and food and the people he had left behind. He probably thought about getting through the next hour. That's the thing about all of this, Shane said. The history books talk about armies and operations and generals. But the person actually living it is just trying to survive the next 5 minutes. Matt nodded slowly. And most of the time, we don't even know their names. They paid and got up and walked out into the night. The air was cool and the street was quiet and the world around them was, by any comparison, remarkably comfortable. They had eaten. They had sat in warmth. They had talked about things that had happened to real people without any of it touching them directly. That was its own kind of thing to sit with. The distance between where they were and what they had been discussing was enormous. And yet those events were not ancient. The last veterans of the Eastern Front had lived into the present era. There were people alive today whose parents had survived things that Shane and Matt had just been trying, for a few hours, to understand. History is not always something that happened long ago. Sometimes it is just 1 or 2 generations back. Sometimes the grandmother at the kitchen table had been a young girl in a city under siege. Sometimes the old man who did not like to talk about the past had crossed a frozen river under fire when he was 20 years old. Shane stopped walking for a moment. I keep thinking about those guys in the penal battalions, he said. Walking through minefields. And the idea that surviving that was how they got their dignity back. Like, that was the deal. It's almost impossible to understand from where we stand, Matt said. Yeah. And yet they did it. They walked on. The night was quiet around them. 2 guys who had spent their careers making people laugh, standing in the middle of something they could not solve and were not trying to. They had just looked at it. Directly and without looking away. That, in the end, was what the evening had been. Not a lecture. Not a history lesson with conclusions and takeaways. Just 2 people sitting down with something enormous and refusing to pretend it was smaller than it was. The Eastern Front will never be a comfortable subject. It should not be. 27 million people do not become comfortable with time. They become more real the closer you look. And the closer you look, the more you understand that history is not a thing that happened to other people in another time. It is a record of what human beings are capable of, the worst of it, and also, somehow, buried inside all that darkness, some of the most extraordinary examples of endurance and loyalty and stubborn refusal to disappear that the world has ever seen. Shane and Matt did not solve any of it that night. Nobody does. But they looked at it. And sometimes that is the most honest thing a person can do,